Good morning. This is Mission Control Houston live from the International Space Station Flight Control Room, where teams are monitoring the final approach of Northrop Grumman's Cygnus cargo vehicle, delivering about 7,500 pounds of research, crew supplies, and hardware to the International Space Station. Leading the teams here in Mission Control Houston is Flight Director Allison Bollinger. She'll be leading the teams here in Mission Control. She'll also be communicating and working hand in hand with Northrop Grumman's teams in Dulles, Virginia. To her right is Steven Zenter, the Capcom today. You're going to hear his voice this morning as he speaks to the crew aboard the International Space Station. He'll be filtering information from the teams here in Mission Control up to astronauts aboard the station. And Visiting Vehicle Officer Jerry Yancharis will be communicating directly with Northrop Grumman flight controllers in Dulles, Virginia, relaying vehicle status and updates back to teams here in Mission Control Houston. And Northrop Grumman Mission Director Paul Brower is monitoring the teams and controllers in the Northrop Grumman Flight Control Center there in Dulles, Virginia.
1.102, Cygnus approach and retreat monitoring.
Copy, and we have tally on Cygnus.
Houston copies.
And getting our first view now of Cygnus as it approaches the International Space Station. Cygnus is approaching what's called the 250-meter hold point. This is one of the hold points just outside the keep-out sphere and one of the milestones designed into Cygnus approach. Once Cygnus reaches that 250-meter hold, teams will run a series of checks and a go-no-go poll from the flight controllers before Cygnus departs that 250-meter hold for the next milestone, which will be the 30-meter hold point. That'll be the last milestone to make sure all of the systems are a go before Cygnus gets about 10 to 12 meters from the International Space Station. And when Cygnus arrives to that capture point this morning, NASA astronaut Drew Morgan will capture the spacecraft with the station's Canadarm2 robotic arm backed up by Jessica Meir of NASA. Following that, the controls of the robotic arm will be handed over to robotics officers on the ground who will then bring Cygnus closer into the station for installation later this morning. This cargo resupply mission started about 3 days ago when Cygnus launched atop an Antares 230 Plus rocket Saturday, February 15th at 2:21 p.m. Central from Pad 0A at NASA's Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. At the time of launch, the International Space Station was flying 258 statute miles over the western Pacific, and about an hour later, solar arrays were deployed and Cygnus continued its journey to the International Space Station. Since then, Cygnus has performed a series of rendezvous burns to fine-tune its path to the International Space Station, where it will arrive this morning around 3:05 a.m. Central Time. Again, getting a view now of Cygnus approaching that 250-meter hold point. Cygnus is now just about 766 meters away from the International Space Station. This resupply mission is delivering about 7,500 pounds of science, research, crew supplies, and vehicle hardware to the International Space Station this morning. Of that 7,500 pounds of cargo is about 2,129 pounds of science investigations. One of those science investigations is the Mobile Space Lab investigation, which is a tissue and cell culturing facility that launches and returns on space station resupply vehicles to offer investigators a quick turnaround platform and to perform sophisticated biology experiments in microgravity. The Mobile Space Lab can perform a biology experiment autonomously for up to a month on the space station without the need for crew operations. Another investigation is the Sapphire 4 investigation. Understanding how fires spread in space is vital for developing flame-resistant materials and fire prevention measures, but it's difficult to perform flame growth and prevention experiments aboard a spacecraft. The Sapphire 4 investigation uses the Cygnus resupply vehicle after it leaves the station to examine fire growth in different materials and environmental conditions. It also demonstrates fire detection, monitoring, and post-fire cleanup capabilities. These are just two of hundreds of experiments currently going on aboard this space station. Research experiments like these two are essential to support future deep space exploration for missions to the moon and onto Mars. The International Space Station is now flying 264 statute miles above Asia, and there are currently 3 crew members aboard the station. Currently on board the station is NASA astronaut Drew Morgan. He's at the controls of the robotic arm today for capture. Station Commander Oleg Skirpochka of Roscosmos and NASA astronaut Jessica Meir. Again, we're standing by as Cygnus approaches the 250-meter hold point on its way to the International Space Station. Once we reach that hold point at 250 meters, Cygnus will maintain that altitude as teams run a series of checks before departing again to the next milestone. Now approaching 500 meters away from the space station, the crew will use the space station's Canadarm2 robotic arm to take hold of Cygnus, and after capture, ground controllers will command the station's robotic arm to rotate and install it on the bottom of the station's Unity module. Cygnus will spend about 3 months attached to the space station until May 11th and will then depart the station to perform its secondary mission objectives before it disposes of several tons of trash from the station during a fiery re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere on May 25th. Again, when Cygnus arrives to the space station this morning, Expedition 62 flight engineer Drew Morgan will capture the spacecraft, backed up by Jessica Meir of NASA. Meir will essentially be a second set of eyes and ears on board the station this morning. Each Cygnus spacecraft is named after influential individuals in the world of spaceflight, and the Cygnus spacecraft for this space station resupply mission is dedicated to U.S. Air Force Major Robert Lawrence, who was the first African-American astronaut selected by any program specifically chosen for the Air Force's Manned Orbital Laboratory program in June of 1967. Lawrence died in an F-104 Starfighter aircraft accident at Edwards Air Force Base 6 months later at the age of 32. You're looking live at the Cygnus cargo resupply spacecraft as it approaches the 250-meter hold point on its way to the International Space Station this morning. As Cygnus continues its journey, we're still on track for an on-time capture around 3:05 a.m. Central Time. Cygnus is delivering about 7,500 pounds of supplies and payloads, including critical materials to directly support dozens of more than 250 science and research investigations that will occur during the space station's expeditions 62 and 63. Of that 7,500 pounds of cargo is 2,129 pounds of science investigations. One of those science investigations includes the MOCHI investigation. MOCHI is a miniature scanning electron microscope that helps in rapid identification of particles found on the space station, many invisible to the eye. Such particles can cause vehicle and equipment malfunctions and threaten crew health, but currently samples must be returned to Earth for analysis, leaving crew and vehicle at risk. MOCHI also provides a powerful new analysis platform to support novel microgravity science and engineering. Cygnus is now about 373 meters away from the International Space Station, which is currently flying above the Pacific Ocean. The Canadarm2 robotic arm that'll capture Cygnus this morning is part of Canada's contribution to the International Space Station. The arm is about 57 feet long and was largely involved in the assembly of the International Space Station. Each end of the Canadarm2 features an identical hand, in a sense, known as the latching end effector. These pieces contain cables that tighten to ensure a strong grip, just as our hands would to pick something up, allowing the robotic arm to firmly grasp objects like we will see today for capture with Cygnus. Once Cygnus is captured this morning, controls of the robotic arm will be handed over to robotics controllers here on the ground in Mission Control Houston. Again, we're just standing by for Cygnus to reach that 250-meter hold point. Once Cygnus reaches that hold, we'll hear confirmation from Capcom Steven Zenter that Cygnus is holding steady Cygnus is now about 330 meters from the station now. Cygnus is now just under 310 meters away from the International Space Station on its way to one of the first milestones built in to Cygnus's approach today, which is the 250-meter hold point. The range and rate we're getting right now is decreasing as expected when approaching that hold point. And once we reach that hold point at 250 meters, Cygnus will maintain that altitude as teams run a series of checks before departing again to the next milestone. Cygnus is set to arrive at that 250-meter hold point just under 8 minutes from now. Here's a view of what's called the Cuckoo workstation. It's a workstation on board the International Space Station. And this is a view from a camera pointing toward that workstation. This is the telemetry data that's being fed to the International Space Station now. NASA astronauts Drew Morgan and Jessica Meir are viewing this now and monitoring the final approach this morning. Taking a live look at Cygnus as it approaches the 250-meter hold point, now just about 268 meters away from the International Space Station, closing in on that 250-meter hold point. Again, this is just one of the holds just outside the keep-out sphere and is one of the milestones designed into Cygnus approach. Once Cygnus reaches that 250-meter hold, teams will run a series of checks and a go, no-go poll from flight controllers before Cygnus departs that 250-meter hold for the next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point. And that'll be the last milestone to make sure all systems are a go before Cygnus gets about 10 to 12 meters away from the station for capture. Now about 3.5 minutes away from that 250-meter hold arrival. When Cygnus arrives to the capture point this morning, NASA astronaut Drew Morgan will capture the spacecraft with the station's Canadarm2 robotic arm, backed up by Jessica Meir of NASA. Following that, the controls of the robotic arm will be handed over to robotics officers on the ground, who will then bring Cygnus closer into the station for installation later this morning. Cygnus is now 258 meters from the International Space Station, again standing by for that 250-meter hold point. Cygnus is now 254 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, we're just waiting for Cygnus to reach that 250-meter hold point. Once Cygnus reaches that hold, we'll hear confirmation from the Capcom here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room that Cygnus is holding steady. Cygnus is now 253 meters out.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Confirm Cygnus 250-meter hold per step 2 and 1.102.
Station copies.
As you just heard, that was Steven Zenter, the Capcom here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room, calling up to Drew Morgan and Jessica Meir, confirming that Cygnus is now holding steady at 250 meters.
Houston Station on 2 for Cygnus. In Block 2, the command panel LED status is nominal. Pri range is 252.37. In Monitor 1, the light is inside the corridor. The vehicle size matches the outline. The light is about half of a vehicle width starboard of the circle. The circle is the same, about half a vehicle width starboard of the center of the corridor. In Monitor 3, the light is inside the corridor. The vehicle size matches the outline. The light is, again, about half of a vehicle width starboard of the circle, and the circle is about half of a vehicle width starboard of the center of the corridor.
All right, Jessica, that is a good report. Thank you.
And we're in a short handover period between satellites right now, but we should be regaining those communications here shortly. Cygnus is now at that 250-meter hold point. The next milestone after the 250-meter hold is when Cygnus will cross the keep-out sphere, which is an imaginary sphere around the International Space Station. After crossing the keep-out sphere, Cygnus will start approaching the 30-meter hold arrival, and that'll be the last milestone to make sure all systems are a go before Cygnus gets about 10 to 20 meters from the space station for capture this morning. Again, Cygnus is now in that hold at 250 meters. The next milestone after the 250-meter hold is when Cygnus will cross the keep-out sphere. And after crossing the keep-out sphere, Cygnus will start approaching the 30-meter hold arrival, and that'll be the last milestone to make sure all systems are a go before Cygnus gets 10 to 12 meters away from the station for capture this morning. When Cygnus arrives to that capture hold point this morning, Drew Morgan will capture the spacecraft with the station's robotic arm, backed up by Jessica Meir. And following that, the controls of the robotic arm will be handed over to robotics officers here on the ground, who will then bring Cygnus closer to the station for installation later this morning. And Cygnus is still holding steady at that 250-meter hold point. Flight controllers here around the room will conduct a go, no-go poll before Cygnus is ready to go ahead and depart from that 250-meter hold onto the next milestone.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Cygnus and ISS are configured for approach inside the keep-out sphere. Expect approach to resume shortly and stand by for the Cygnus PCS command checkout.
Station copies.
Station Houston on 2. Cygnus has resumed approach. Go for Cygnus PCS command checkout. Hold arm per step 3 in 1.102.
Copy, go for step 3 and 1.102.
We have confirmation that Cygnus has left the hold, heading toward the next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point just after crossing the keep-out sphere. You'll hear Capcom Steven Zenter continue the readouts, going through a checklist that the crew on board the station also has, working together for these operations for capture of Northrop Grumman's Cygnus cargo vehicle to the International Space Station today.
Houston Station on 2. Hold command is armed.
Houston copies. In Jessica, we have hold arm confirmed. Go for Cygnus PCS command checkout, disarm per step 4.
Copy, go for disarm step 4. Houston Station on 2 for Cygnus. Step 4, hold command is disarmed.
Houston copies. And Station Houston on 2. Cygnus PCS command checkout was successful. Begin monitoring approach from 250 meters per step 5 and 1.102.
Copy, go for step 5.
Just to recap so far, Cygnus has departed the 250-meter hold point and is headed to the next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point. We'll continue to get views as Cygnus approaches the International Space Station, carrying about 7,500 pounds of vehicle hardware, crew supplies, science, and research.
Station Houston on 2. Cygnus is inside the 200-meter keep-out sphere. You now have authority to issue an abort if no comm with MCCH, and the light is outside the corridor.
Station copies.
And you just heard that call from Capcom Steven Zenter, letting the crew on board the station know that Cygnus is now inside the keep-out sphere, or the neighborhood of the space station, and a good readout called back from NASA astronaut Jessica Meir.
Houston Station on 2 for Block Bravo.
We're ready for Block Bravo.
Both monitors 1 and 3, the light is inside the corridor. The vehicle size matches the outline. The light is about a vehicle width port of the circle. And correction, the light is a vehicle width starboard of the circle. And the circle is a vehicle width port of the center of the corridor.
We copy. Good report.
Taking another look from what's called the Cuckoo Workstation. It's a workstation on board the International Space Station, and this is a view from a camera pointing toward that workstation. This is the telemetry data that's being fed to the International Space Station now, where NASA astronauts Drew Morgan and Jessica Meir are viewing this and monitoring the final approach this morning. Again, Cygnus has departed that 250-meter hold point on its way to the International Space Station and is headed to the next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point. We'll continue to get views as Cygnus approaches the International Space Station, carrying about 7,500 pounds of vehicle hardware, crew supplies, science, and research. Within that cargo is 2,129 pounds of science investigations. Cygnus is now sitting about 120 meters away from the International Space Station on its way to that next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point. Once Cygnus arrives to the 30-meter hold point, the crew will have the option to turn off the orientation lights, and mission control teams in Dulles will perform state of health checks on the Cygnus vehicle. This 30-meter hold point is basically the stopping point to verify everything is in the green and looks good before it makes its final approach to the International Space Station for capture this morning. The International Space Station and Cygnus now in an orbital nighttime, flying 268 statute miles above the Pacific Ocean. And Cygnus is now just under about 100 meters from the International Space Station on its way to that next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point. This cargo resupply mission started 3 days ago when Cygnus launched atop an Antares 230 Plus rocket Saturday, February 15th at 2:21 p.m. Central from Pad 0A at NASA's Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. At the time of launch, the International Space Station was flying 258 statute miles over the western Pacific, and about an hour later, solar arrays were deployed and Cygnus continued its journey to the International Space Station. Cygnus is now just under 80 meters away from the International Space Station on its final trek there for its arrival. Again, Cygnus is approaching the 30-meter hold point, which is the next milestone. The 30-meter hold point is a very important milestone because the next one will be the arrival of Cygnus at the capture point about 10 to 12 meters from the International Space Station. Again, this resupply mission is delivering about 7,500 pounds of science, research, crew supplies, and vehicle hardware to the International Space Station this morning. And of that 7,500 pounds of cargo is about 2,129 pounds of science investigations. One of those investigations is the Mobile Space Lab investigation, which is a tissue and cell culturing facility that launches and returns on space station resupply vehicles to offer investigators a quick turnaround platform to perform sophisticated biology experiments in microgravity. The Mobile Space Lab can perform a biology experiment autonomously for up to a month on the space station without the need for crew operations. Just to recap so far, Cygnus departed the 250-meter hold point and crossed the keep-out sphere, or the neighborhood of the space station, and is headed to the next milestone, which is the 30-meter hold point. We'll continue getting views as Cygnus approaches the International Space Station, carrying about 7,500 pounds of vehicle hardware, crew supplies, science, and research. Cygnus is now just under 53 meters away from the International Space Station. Cygnus and the International Space Station still flying in that orbital nighttime over the Pacific Ocean, approaching South America. Looking live at Cygnus as it approaches the 30-meter hold point, now sitting about 40 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, once Cygnus arrives to the 30-meter hold point, mission control teams in Dulles will perform state of health checks on the Cygnus vehicle. This 30-meter hold point is basically the stopping point to verify everything is in the green and looks good before Cygnus makes its final approach to the International Space Station for capture this morning. Cygnus is still approaching that 30-meter hold point, now sitting about 34 meters away from the station.
Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Confirm 30-meter hold and set up for capture per step 6 in 1.102.
Copy. Step 6 is in work.
You just heard from Capcom Steven Zenter here in Mission Control Houston that Cygnus has arrived to the 30-meter hold point successfully. Again, teams are working now and running a series of checks to make sure everything looks good on the vehicle before its final approach to the station. The space station and Cygnus are currently traveling over South America.
29.
Copy 30.29.
Stepping into step 3 of 1.110.
As the series of checks continue, at this 30-meter hold point, there will also be a go, no-go from the flight controllers, making sure everything on their end checks out before the final approach to the station. Again, this 30-meter hold is a very important milestone because the next one will be the arrival of Cygnus at the capture point about 10 to 12 meters from the International Space Station. And you can see the robotic arm at the bottom of your screen now. That robotic arm is in position and ready to reach out to capture the 7,500 pounds of cargo traveling today. Cygnus is still at that 30-meter hold point, waiting to depart. You'll hear that from Capcom Steven Zenter here in Mission Control Houston.
Houston station on 2 for Cygnus.
Houston's here.
Crew is ready for Cygnus approach to capture point.
We copy. Station Houston on 2. Cygnus is ready to proceed to the capture point. Expect approach to resume shortly.
Station copies.
That was Capcom Steven Zenter here in Mission Control Houston, confirming Cygnus is ready to depart from that 30-meter hold point. Still in a 30-meter hold position, but we should be getting confirmation soon once it departs. Again, this is the last milestone before Cygnus arrives at the capture point, 10 to 12 meters away from the International Space Station.
Station Houston on 2. Cygnus has resumed approach to the capture point. Monitor approach within 30 meters per step 7 in 1.102. You are primed to issue retreat if pry range is less than 6 meters.
Step 7.
Cygnus is now under 30 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, this is the final approach as Cygnus heads into the capture point. Once Cygnus is captured, there are several more steps to make sure Cygnus is ready to be berthed to the International Space Station, which will happen later this morning. At the controls of the Canadarm2 robotic arm this morning is NASA astronaut Drew Morgan, backed up by NASA astronaut Jessica Meir. Cygnus is now 22 meters and closing, looking for that capture point about 10 to 12 meters from where the Canadarm is now. Cygnus is now under 20 meters from the International Space Station. You can see Cygnus coming into view at the top of your screen, now 18 meters away and closing. The International Space Station and Cygnus now flying 262 statute miles above the Atlantic Ocean. Getting this view now from a camera at the end of the space station's robotic arm. Cygnus now 15 meters away from the International Space Station. Starting to see some different components of Cygnus as it comes into view. The top left and right of your screen are those ultraflex solar arrays on Cygnus. And that circle toward the bottom of Cygnus is where the Canadarm2 will be moving in today. Cygnus now 13 meters from the International Space Station.
Station Houston on 2. Confirm capture point hold per step 8 in 1.102.
Copy, step 8.
That was confirmation Cygnus is holding at the capture point, now just over 12 meters away from the International Space Station. Now that Cygnus has arrived at the capture point, teams will do a final go, no-go, which will be the final steps that all systems are a go and the crew can take controls of the Canadarm2 robotic arm. Again, at the controls of the robotic arm today are NASA astronauts Drew Morgan, backed up by Jessica Meir. Cygnus is still holding steady at the capture point, just over 12 meters from the International Space Station, as teams run a go, no-go poll to ensure all systems are a go for capture this morning.
Houston Station on 2 for Cygnus. Capture conditions are confirmed and the crew is ready for Cygnus capture.
Houston copies. Stand by for capture.
Houston, station on 2 for Cygnus, standing by for your go and step 4.1.
Station Houston on 2, your go for Cygnus capture sequence, step 4 in 1.110, Cygnus capture. Begin monitoring the backaway cue card.
Station copies.
That was Capcom's Steven Zenter confirming Cygnus is a go for capture. All of the milestones this morning are complete, now heading into our last step of the capture itself. In just a few more minutes, we should start to see the robotic arm moving in closer to Cygnus for an on-time capture today. Once the Canadarm2 starts moving, there will be a series of checks before capture, some readouts of the distance from the arm to the capture position over the pin. Then the snares will be closed and we'll wait for confirmation of capture. Cygnus is now in free drift, configured for capture. The International Space Station and Cygnus are now flying 266 statute miles above Moscow. And we have confirmation the arm is in motion. Again, this is the final stretch for capture of the Cygnus resupply cargo craft this morning. Cygnus is now 2.5 meters away. Meters away. .5 meters. .1 meter away from capture. Now over the pin. And we have confirmed capture at 3:05 a.m. Central, 4:05 a.m. Eastern, as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 265 statute miles above southeastern Russia.
Houston Station on 2, Cygnus capture complete. Go for Cygnus post-capture reconfiguration.
Houston copies. Congratulations on a beautiful capture. We're excited to see the SS Robert H. Lawrence Jr. at the ISS. and we are looking forward to the many science investigations that the Cygnus spacecraft carries as the mission honors the legacy of Major Lawrence.
Thanks, Stephen, and congratulations to the entire NASA and Northrop Grumman teams on another successful vehicle capture. The Cygnus NG-13 vehicle, as Stephen mentioned, is named in honor of U.S. Air Force Major Robert H. Lawrence, Jr., and as the first African-American to be selected as an astronaut by a national space program, Robert defined possible against the odds when he was selected for the U.S. Air Force's Manned Orbital Laboratory Project in 1967. Tragically, Major Lawrence died in an aircraft training accident that same year. But while Robert never launched into Earth orbit, he remains a valuable symbol of progress and inclusion in human spaceflight, and it's our honor to welcome the SS Robert H. Lawrence, Jr. aboard the ISS.
And some words from Capcom Steven Zenter and Drew Morgan aboard the International Space Station, who successfully captured the Cygnus vehicle today at 3:05 a.m. Central, 4:05 a.m. Eastern, as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 265 statute miles above southeastern Russia. Cygnus began its journey to the International Space Station after lifting off from the Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia on top of an Antares 250 Plus rocket on Saturday, February 15th at 2:21 p.m. Central Time. Cygnus made a 3-day journey to be captured by NASA astronaut Drew Morgan at the controls of the Canadarm2 robotic arm alongside NASA astronaut Jessica Meir at 3:05 a.m. Central Time today, as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 265 statute miles over southeastern Russia. The Cygnus spacecraft for this space station resupply mission was dedicated to U.S. Air Force Major Robert Lawrence, who was the first African-American astronaut selected by any program, specifically chosen for the Air Force's Manned Orbital Laboratory Program in June of 1967. We'll be back on air here shortly at 5 a.m. Central Time, 6 a.m. Eastern for berthing coverage, where the Robert Lawrence will be installed to the International Space Station before that 7,500 pounds of cargo can be unloaded. And that'll wrap up our coverage for a successful capture this morning. This is Mission Control Houston.